At my age, you spend a lot of time looking back, not out of regret, but because when you've sat in a quiet room for 45 years listening to thousands of souls bare their deepest hurts, you start to see the invisible threads that tie us all together. I'm Stanley Miller, and if you're sitting on the other side of this screen today, maybe resting in your favorite armchair with a cup of tea, I want to welcome you to my living room. We are here today to talk about something very close to my heart, something I call getting your family out of your nervous system. I look at the world today and I see so many of us, especially as we get older, carrying this heavy, invisible luggage from decades ago, still trying to make sense of why we feel so tired on the inside even when our lives look perfectly fine on the outside. We look successful. We've built careers, raised families, and done all the things we were supposed to do. Yet there's this quiet, nagging whisper that asks, who actually are you when nobody else needs you to be someone? Today, I want to share 7 profound lessons that 45 years in the therapist's chair have taught me about how we get lost, and more importantly, how we find our way back to our true selves. Let's start with our very first lesson today, which is a hard truth but the only place we can truly begin. No one from your past is coming to set you free. I know how painful that is to hear, and believe me, I've sat with people in their 70s and 80s who were still holding their breath, waiting for an apology that was never going to come. They were still waiting for a parent, a sibling, or an ex-spouse to finally look them in the eye and say, I see what I did to you, it was my fault, and I am so sorry. But let me tell you something as gently as I possibly can. If your healing is waiting on their understanding, then your freedom is still in their hands. The people who broke you are very rarely the ones who have the tools, the capacity, or the desire to repair you. When you finally stop expecting them to be capable of what they simply cannot do, you can grieve the ending you always wanted, lay that heavy expectation down, and finally start building the life you actually needed all along. That brings me directly to our second lesson, which helps us understand why we keep waiting in the first place. Your role in that family was an assignment, not a choice. When we are children, we don't get to choose our parts in the play. If a household is anxious, tense, or emotionally unbalanced, the family system naturally hands out jobs to keep the ship from sinking. Maybe you were the golden child who had to carry the heavy burden of the family's pride, or perhaps you were the invisible child who survived by learning to need absolutely nothing from anyone. Some of you reading this were the peacemakers, learning to read the microscopic shifts in the room's temperature before you ever learned to understand your own feelings. And then, of course, there is the scapegoat, the one who carried the blame for all the anxiety the rest of the family refused to face. I've often found that the scapegoat is actually the healthiest, most perceptive person in the room because they saw the truth, and the family had to discredit them to protect the lie. You didn't cast yourself in these roles, my friends. But the tragedy is that many of us are still playing those same parts in our marriages, our friendships, and our workplaces today, because nobody ever tapped us on the shoulder to tell us that the play ended 50 years ago. And that leads us to our third lesson, which is the realization that what you've always called your personality is often just a defense mechanism you built to survive. We look at ourselves in the mirror and say, well, Stanley, I'm just a natural-born perfectionist, I'm just an overthinker, or I'm just a people-pleaser. But when I sit with people and we peel back the layers, we find that these weren't personality traits at all. They were survival strategies. You learned to scan the room because the emotional weather in your childhood home could turn from calm to violent in a matter of seconds. You learned to be absolutely perfect because making a mistake felt incredibly dangerous. You learned to give and give until you were empty because being useful was the only currency that bought you safety. That isn't your soul, my friends. That is your programming. And the beautiful thing about programming is that it can be unlearned, dismantled, and rewritten once you realize that you are not who that anxious house required you to be. Now, let us move to our fourth lesson for today, which explains why simply escaping the physical space never seems to be enough. You can leave the home, but the home doesn't easily leave you. I will never forget a dear woman I worked with who decided she had had enough, packed her bags, and moved 1,600 miles away from her mother. She went 10 years with almost no contact, believing she had finally escaped the storm. But she told me that one evening, she was sitting in her quiet kitchen, and her phone lit up with a simple text message from her mother. Before she could even finish reading the first sentence, her heart was hammering, her throat tightened, and she felt like she was a defenseless 12-year-old child all over again. You see, physical distance protects your schedule and your daily routine, but it does absolutely nothing to touch the deep-seated programming wired into your nervous system. We carry our families inside us, in the harsh, critical voice that narrates our failures, in the people we constantly feel the need to perform for, and in the way we flinch when someone raises their voice. We cannot simply run away from the past because we carry the house with us wherever we go, which is why the real work isn't about changing your address, but about changing what lives inside you. This brings us right to our fifth lesson, and it's a trap I see so many well-meaning, intelligent people fall into, especially nowadays when there is so much talk about mental health and boundary setting. Managing your family is not the exact same thing as healing from your family. Over my 45 years in that chair, I've watched people spend decades becoming absolute experts on their family's dysfunction. They can write a textbook on their mother's narcissism, their father's emotional unavailability, or their siblings' enabling behaviors. They spend hours planning how to handle the next holiday, crafting the perfect text message to set a boundary, deciding on low contact or declaring no contact. And while I want to tell you that these survival strategies are incredibly useful and sometimes very necessary to keep you safe from harm, I have never once seen a single one of these strategies actually heal a human soul. The reason is simple yet so easily missed. Every single one of those strategies keeps your eyes, your heart, and your energy pointed directly at them. You are still studying them, anticipating their next move, and reacting to their shadow. Even when you are explaining to a friend how wrong they were, you are still mentally sitting in their living room. Healing doesn't happen by learning how to manage the people out there. Healing only truly begins the moment you change the target and focus on getting them out of you, out of your nervous system, out of your reactions, and out of the way you love. To do that, we have to look at our sixth lesson, which requires us to lift our eyes from the individuals and see the bigger picture. It was never just about your parents, because a family is an entire orchestra. When I was a young therapist, eager and a bit naive, I made the massive mistake of staring only at the person everyone in the family pointed to as the problem. I would spend months trying to understand one difficult parent, trying to figure out why they were so angry, so controlling, or so cold. But the longer I sat in that room, the more I realized I was focusing entirely on a single violin while ignoring the rest of the orchestra playing the background music. A family is a living, breathing emotional system, and that system is governed by powerful, unwritten rules designed to keep things exactly as they are. Rules like keep the most anxious person comfortable at all costs, never talk about what is actually happening, or protect the family name even if it destroys the children. When you start to see the system, you stop asking what was wrong with just one person, and you start seeing how the whole house was organized to keep those rules alive. You begin to notice the quiet parent who never raised their voice but saw everything, did nothing, and by their very silence held the entire dysfunctional structure in place, just as much as the loudest parent did. The moment you stop hunting for one bad person to blame and start seeing the system as a whole, your entire childhood finally begins to make sense, and the weight of thinking it was all your fault starts to lift off your shoulders. And that brings us to our seventh and final lesson, the crowning achievement of my 45 years of work, and the only thing I have ever seen bring true lasting peace, the journey of self-differentiation. This is the beautiful, natural process of separating who you truly are from who your past and your family programmed you to be. You see, my friends, we are actually born with the biological capability to do this. If you look at nature, at the very miracle of life in the womb, a single cell divides into two, and then those cells begin to differentiate, taking on their own unique functions to form a whole, beautiful human being. We are meant to do the same thing emotionally in our families. In healthier homes, this is nurtured. Children are allowed and encouraged to become themselves. But in highly anxious homes, being your true self is treated as an active threat to the system, so you are forced to build a fake, pseudo-self to survive. Self-differentiation is the quiet practice of reclaiming your true self. It is the ability to stay calm, clear, and uniquely yourself, whether you are standing in a room full of your family's reactivity or standing entirely alone. Do you remember that dear woman I told you about earlier? The one who would turn back into a trembling 12-year-old whenever her mother texted her? Well, she committed herself to this quiet work of self-differentiation. She didn't run away further, and she didn't pick a fight. Instead, she slowly untangled her identity from her mother's expectations. And months later, she told me about an evening where her phone lit up with another one of those familiar, demanding text messages from her mother. But this time, she didn't flinch. Her heart didn't race. She simply read the text, recognized that the anxiety belonged entirely to her mother and not to her, gently put the phone face down on the table, and went right back to enjoying her quiet evening. Nothing changed on the outside. The text was still the same, but on the inside, she was entirely free. She had finally realized, that is them, and this is me. I don't have to carry their storm anymore. That, my friends, is what real healing looks like. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, and it doesn't require a grand confrontation. It is the quiet realization of who you are when nobody else needs you to be anyone for them. There is a beautiful, true self buried right underneath all that heavy programming your family trained you to carry. And going back to rescue that self is the most sacred, important work you will ever do in this life. Thank you so much for sitting with me today, for opening your hearts, and for listening to these stories from my 45 years in the chair. It has been an absolute privilege to share this time with you. Take a deep breath, lay down those heavy burdens you were never meant to carry, and remember to always be gentle with yourselves. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and as I always say, be wise.